the small, unassuming video camera. It became Arthur Finch's constant companion, not for holiday snapshots, nor for capturing life's fleeting, joyful moments. Finch's lens was turned towards something far darker, something altogether more disturbing. He chose to document the ultimate transgression, the taking of human life, his own acts, his own crimes. This decision to press record before committing murder catapulted his case into a realm of unparalleled horror. It wasn't just the act itself, already heinous, it was the cold, deliberate preservation of it. A private theatre of cruelty intended for an audience of one, or so perhaps he initially thought. Imagine the scene, the ordinary mundane settings, a quiet suburban street, a dimly lit car park. These were Finch's chosen stages, and on these stages he was not just the perpetrator, he was the director, the cinematographer, the star of his own grotesque productions. The camera, often crudely positioned, became a silent, unblinking witness. It captured everything, the fear in his victim's eyes, the chilling detachment in his own, the final desperate moments. These recordings weren't an afterthought. They were integral to his ritual, a deeply unsettling fusion of modern technology and ancient evil. The very idea sends a shiver down the spine, doesn't it? A murderer, not content with the act of killing, but driven by a compulsion to film it, to possess it, to replay it. This transforms the crime. It adds another layer of violation, another dimension of premeditation. It speaks of a profound disconnect from humanity, a chilling narcissism. The camera wasn't merely a tool. It was an extension of his will, his desire to control, to dominate, even beyond the grave. It offered a perverse form of immortality for his terrible deeds, a legacy he actively curated. What possesses a man to do this, to turn the lens on such depravity? The shock is not just in the violence, it is in the meticulous documentation. The casual way a camera, an instrument of memory and connection for most, could be so terribly perverted. Arthur Finch didn't just shatter lives, he shattered our understanding of the limits of human cruelty. He forced us to confront the unsettling possibility that, for some, the act of recording evil is as compelling as the evil itself. And in doing so, he left an indelible stain, not just on his victims, but on our collective consciousness. This case was different. Profoundly, sickeningly different. We've encountered killers before, of course. Their motives are often tangled, their methods brutal. But Arthur Finch introduced a new, horrifying dimension. He recorded his crimes. This wasn't a fleeting impulse, it was a systematic practice. Each murder meticulously filmed, each act of terror preserved in digital format. This macabre archive, discovered by investigators, set his case apart. It provided a chilling first-person perspective on his atrocities. A viewpoint no one ever wished to see. Yet it existed, a testament to his unique brand of evil. The uniqueness lay not just in the act of recording, but in its implications. For investigators, it was a double-edged sword, irrefutable evidence, certainly, but also a deeply disturbing insight into the killer's mind. It removed any doubt about his presence, his actions, his intent. The camera became the ultimate, impartial witness, even if wielded by the perpetrator. This wasn't about grainy CCTV footage from a distance. This was intimate, deliberate. The killer himself framing the shot, the lens capturing what he wanted it to capture. It was a horrifying spectacle of control. Think about what this meant. The videos weren't just evidence, they were a direct transmission from the heart of darkness. They offered a glimpse into Finch's psyche that no confession, no psychological profile could ever truly replicate. The cold calculation, the moments before, during and after, the raw, unedited horror. This level of self-documentation in such heinous crimes was thankfully rare. It pushed the boundaries of what we thought possible in criminal behavior. It forced society to confront a new kind of predator, one who not only reveled in the act, but also in its permanent visual record. The psychological impact of this uniqueness cannot be overstated. It transformed Finch from a mere murderer into something more, a curator of his own cruelty, a director of real-life horror films where the victims were unwilling participants and the endings were always tragic. This compulsion to record added a layer of profound sadism. It suggested a desire to relive the events, to maintain power over his victims even after their deaths. The recordings were his trophies, his monument to his own depravity, and their existence changed everything. For the investigation, for the families, for society. The investigation into Arthur Finch's crimes took a sharp, chilling turn with the discovery of the videotapes. Initially, detectives were piecing together fragments, witness statements, forensic evidence, and the usual components of a complex homicide case. But then came the breakthrough. A search of Finch's unassuming flat in a quiet Reading cul-de-sac. Tucked away, almost proudly, was his collection. Hours of footage. The recordings were a game-changer. They provided an undeniable, horrifying narrative authored by the killer himself. Suddenly the who was crystal clear. The how was displayed in gruesome detail. These tapes were not accidental captures. They were meticulously, almost obsessively, catalogued. Each recording labeled with a cryptic code, a date, perhaps a victim identifier only Finch understood. Investigators had to steel themselves to watch, to analyze, to dissect hours of unspeakable acts. The videos became the backbone of the prosecution's case. They eliminated ambiguity. They silenced any potential claims of misidentification or diminished responsibility. Finch had, in essence, filmed his own conviction. His desire to document had become his undoing, providing an irrefutable chronicle of his guilt. The content of these videos was, as one might expect, profoundly disturbing. They showed the planning, the stalking, the final brutal encounters. The camera often placed to capture the victim's terror and Finch's chilling composure, or sometimes his feigned empathy, a cruel prelude to violence. Forensic psychologists pored over the footage looking for clues, not just to what he did, but why. The way he spoke, the things he focused on. Every frame was scrutinized. The tapes offered a horrifying window into a deeply disturbed mind, one that saw human beings as props in his own dreadful narrative. For the police, the tapes were both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because they provided such concrete evidence. The path to conviction seemed shorter, more certain, but a curse because of the psychological toll on those who had to view them. Officers seasoned by years of confronting the worst of humanity found themselves shaken. The cold, deliberate nature of the recordings, the sheer inhumanity on display was unlike anything many had encountered. Finch's camera had not only captured murder, it had captured a new depth of calculated cruelty, forever changing the landscape of the investigation. Why? That's the question that hangs heavy in the air. Why would Arthur Finch choose to record his monstrous acts? The investigators and psychologists who studied his case offered several theories, none of them comforting. One prominent idea revolves around power and control. For Finch, a man likely feeling insignificant in other areas of his life, the camera offered a way to script reality, to be the puppet master. He controlled the narrative, he controlled the victim, and by recording it, he could relive that feeling of absolute dominance again and again. The recordings were an extension of his power. Another perspective suggests a profound, almost pathological narcissism. Finch may have seen himself as the central character in his own dark drama. The recordings were his cinematic achievements, twisted though they were. He was the director, the star, the anti-hero of his own making. This wasn't just about the act of killing, it was about crafting a legacy, however vile. He wanted his actions to be seen, even if initially only by himself. The camera validated his sense of importance, his perverted sense of self. It was a mirror, reflecting his grotesque self-image. There's also the possibility of a dissociative element. Perhaps filming allowed Finch to create a psychological distance from the horror he was inflicting. By viewing it through a lens, he could objectify his victims, turning them into characters in a film rather than human beings experiencing unimaginable terror. This detachment could have made the acts easier for him to commit, or perhaps even enhanced his perverse satisfaction. The camera became a barrier, a filter through which his cruelty was channeled, almost as if he were watching someone else perform these acts. Ultimately, Finch's motives were likely a complex tapestry of these twisted threads, a desire for control, a deep-seated narcissism, a way to relive and savor his power, perhaps even a macabre form of trophy collection where the recordings were more prized than any physical memento. He wasn't just a killer, he was an archivist of his own evil. The act of recording was not ancillary to his crimes, it was central. It fed his psychological needs, however warped they were. Understanding this compulsion is crucial, not to excuse, but to comprehend the depths to which a human mind can sink. For the families of Arthur Finch's victims, the discovery of the recordings unleashed a new dimension of agony. Learning a loved one has been murdered is a devastating blow, an unbearable weight of grief. But to then learn that their final moments, their terror, their suffering, were captured on video by the perpetrator himself, that is a horror almost beyond comprehension. It compounds the trauma. It adds a layer of violation that is deeply personal and, honestly, incredibly cruel. The knowledge that such recordings exist becomes a haunting presence, an inescapable shadow over their mourning. The existence of these tapes meant that the families were confronted with the most graphic and intimate details of their loved ones' deaths. While they were, thankfully, spared from viewing the actual footage in most instances, the sheer knowledge of its content was a torment. Every news report, every court proceeding that mentioned the videos would have been a fresh stab of pain. It forced them to imagine the unimaginable, to picture those final filmed moments. This wasn't just about loss. It was about the brutal, recorded reality of that loss, a reality curated by the man who caused it. The legal process, too, became more harrowing. The tapes were evidence crucial to securing Finch's conviction. But their use in court, even if described rather than shown publicly, meant that the horror was repeatedly revisited. For the families, attending court or even following the proceedings meant being constantly reminded of this grotesque archive. It's a terrible paradox. The very evidence that could bring justice also inflicted further psychological wounds. The recordings ensured Finch's guilt was undeniable, but they also ensured the family's suffering was uniquely amplified. Beyond the immediate grief, there was the lasting impact. How does one ever truly find peace knowing such a recording exists? That a visual record of such profound trauma is out there, even if secured by authorities. It's a violation that extends beyond the physical act of murder. It's a theft of dignity, a permanent desecration of memory. The families were not just robbed of their loved ones, they were robbed of the chance to remember them without the horrifying spectre of Finch's camera, his unblinking, malevolent eye, intruding on their most private moments of sorrow. The revelation of Arthur Finch's methods sent ripples of fear far beyond the immediate families of his victims. The town, a usually quiet collection of streets and routines, found itself at the epicenter of a media storm. But more than that, it found itself confronting a new kind of fear. This wasn't just about a murderer in their midst. It was about a murderer who used technology, an everyday tool, as an instrument of his terror. The camera, once a benign object, suddenly felt imbued with a sinister potential. This specific detail, the recording of his crimes, resonated deeply and disturbingly with the wider public. People began to look over their shoulders a little more, a stranger holding a phone, a CCTV camera on a building. These ordinary sights could spark a flicker of unease. Finch's actions tapped into a primal fear, the loss of control, the violation of privacy, magnified by the chilling permanence of a digital recording. The idea that someone could not only harm you, but also document your suffering for their own perverse pleasure was a terrifying thought. It made the threat feel more invasive, more personal, even for those who had no direct connection to the crimes. The case fueled anxieties about the darker side of our increasingly documented world. If Finch could use a simple camera for such evil, what other terrors could technology facilitate? It sparked conversations about surveillance, not just by the state, but by individuals with malicious intent. The ease with which such recordings could be made and potentially shared added another layer to the communal anxiety. The fear was not just of violence, but of that violence being captured, replayed, perhaps even existing indefinitely in some dark corner of the digital world. This pervasive sense of unease lingered long after Finch was apprehended. It changed the way some people moved through their town, the way they perceived strangers, the way they thought about their own digital footprint. The community was scarred not just by the violence, but by the method. Arthur Finch didn't just take lives, he stole a sense of security, replacing it with a chilling awareness of how technology, in the wrong hands, could amplify and immortalize the very worst of human behavior. The shadows cast by his camera were long and cold. The media coverage of the Arthur Finch case was predictably intense. A killer who films his murders is a story that grips the public imagination, albeit in a morbid way. News outlets, both traditional and digital, descended upon the story with vigor. The existence of the tapes became the central, horrifying detail that dominated headlines. The camera killer, Finch's film of fear. These sensational labels were plastered across newspapers and websites. The public's appetite for true crime is undeniable, but this case pushed the boundaries of what was considered reportable and how. A significant ethical debate emerged regarding the tapes. How much detail should be shared with the public? While the actual footage was never released, and rightly so, the descriptions of its contents were often graphic. Journalists wrestled with the need to inform the public about the severity of Finch's crimes versus the risk of sensationalizing the violence and causing further distress to the victims' families and the community. Some outlets opted for more restrained reporting, focusing on the investigation and the psychological aspects, while others leaned into the more lurid details, feeding the public's macabre curiosity. The constant media attention had a profound impact. On one hand, it ensured that Finch became a notorious figure, his crimes widely condemned. It perhaps contributed to public vigilance. On the other hand, the relentless focus on the recordings could be seen as inadvertently amplifying Finch's perverse desire for notoriety. If his goal was to create a lasting, shocking legacy, the media in some ways helped him achieve that. The sheer volume of coverage also made it incredibly difficult for the victims' families to escape the constant reminders of their trauma. Their private grief played out on a public stage. Furthermore, the case highlighted the challenges faced by media in the digital age. The speed at which information and misinformation could spread was a significant factor. Online forums buzzed with speculation, and the gruesome nature of the recordings fueled a morbid fascination. Ethical lines blurred as citizen journalists and social media commentators weighed in, sometimes irresponsibly. The Finch tapes forced a difficult conversation about the media's role to report the facts, certainly, but also to consider the human cost of that reporting, especially when dealing with evidence of such profound depravity. The horrific saga of Arthur Finch and his recorded murders, while deeply tragic, did compel law enforcement and society to confront some uncomfortable truths and learn vital lessons. One of the immediate takeaways for police forces was the need for enhanced training in dealing with digital evidence of extreme violence. The psychological impact on officers viewing such material is significant, and protocols for support and debriefing became a more pressing concern. Furthermore, the technical expertise required to recover, analyze, and present such digital evidence in court was underscored. Beyond policing, the case served as a stark reminder of the evolving nature of crime in a technologically advanced society. It highlighted how everyday devices could be weaponized in unimaginable ways. This prompted renewed discussions about digital literacy and awareness, not just for preventing oneself from becoming a victim of online scams, but for understanding the potential for technology to be used in violent crime. It raised questions about whether tech companies themselves have a role to play, though the complexities of privacy and freedom of expression make that a difficult path to navigate. For communities, the Finch case and others like it, albeit rare, forced a reassessment of personal safety and vigilance. It wasn't about succumbing to paranoia, but about fostering a realistic awareness of potential threats. Neighborhood watch schemes saw renewed interest, and discussions around public surveillance, its benefits and drawbacks became more nuanced. The case demonstrated that evil could wear an ordinary face and employ ordinary tools for extraordinary cruelty, prompting a subtle shift in how people perceive their surroundings and the individuals within them. Perhaps the most profound lesson, though, was a reaffirmation of the importance of human connection and community support in the face of such darkness. While technology enabled Finch's depravity, it was human empathy, the dedication of investigators, the support for victims' families, and the collective revulsion of society that ultimately condemned his actions. The case underscored that while technology is a powerful tool, it is the human element, our morality, our compassion, and our resolve that must guide its use and stand against its misuse. The sorrow etched by Finch's crimes also forged a stronger understanding of these enduring values. Arthur Finch's case serves as a chilling testament to the double-edged nature of technology. The same tools that connect us, that preserve our happiest memories, that drive innovation and progress, can, in the wrong hands, become instruments of profound darkness. The video camera in Finch's world was not a device for creativity or connection, but a cold, unblinking eye that magnified his cruelty, that sought to immortalize his depravity. His story is a stark illustration of how easily accessible technology can be perverted to serve the most twisted of human impulses. We live in an era of unprecedented documentation, smartphones in every pocket, CCTV cameras on many corners, the constant hum of the digital world capturing our lives. This can bring benefits, accountability, evidence, connection. Yet the Finch case forces us to confront the sinister underbelly. It highlights a disturbing potential for the tools of modern life to be co-opted for acts of extreme violence and psychological terror. The ease of recording, the potential for dissemination, adds new layers to criminal behavior, creating challenges for law enforcement and new anxieties for society. This isn't an argument against technology itself, of course. That would be futile and misguided. Technology is, by its nature, neutral. Its moral alignment is determined by the user. But cases like Arthur Finch's demand a heightened awareness, a more critical engagement with the tools we create and use. They compel us to think about safeguards, about ethical considerations, about the psychological impact of living in a world where anything can be recorded. It's a conversation about responsibility, individual and collective, in the face of rapidly evolving technological capabilities. Ultimately, the story of the killer who records his murders is a cautionary tale for the digital age. It reminds us that human nature, with all its potential for good and for evil, remains a constant. Technology merely provides new arenas, new methods for these ancient tendencies to play out. As we continue to innovate, to weave technology ever more deeply into the fabric of our lives, we must also remain vigilant, mindful of its potential for misuse, and resolute in our commitment to ensuring it serves humanity rather than its darkest shadows. The unblinking lens can capture truth and beauty, or it can reflect the void. The choice and the responsibility remains with us.